I'll just start there. Thank you very much. It's a real honour to speak at the Assembly. I've never spoken something like this before. I think it's unique, really. It's a brilliant thing to do. I'm going to talk about what we call behavioural economics. There's a lot of complicated definitions of it. It's basically trying to get under the skin of the psychology of how people make these decisions. So pensions are really complicated. They involve decisions about the future. So in economics, we've tended to assume that people do these things fairly rationally and they're good at calculating numbers and all of that, whereas for most of us, these are complicated decisions with a lot of complex information, a lot of scenarios that you've got to forecast. So even, if you look at expert judgment in these areas, is not always perfect. So when we're trying to do it ourselves with all the other things we have to do in our day-to-day lives, a lot of psychological factors creep in. So I'll talk a bit about those and then really get into if your aim was to increase pension participation, how would you work with these psychological features? So how would you, if the task tomorrow was just to light a match under pension participation and get it sorted out pretty quickly, how would you do it? And how would you do it in a way that would respect people's choices, as well as, not generating negative side effects? And I'm going to talk about these. Some of them have been alluded to earlier on. I suppose the most direct way would be mandatory, which we'll talk about, but then variants of it, like automatic enrolment, where you simply say to people, look, you're in a pension, opt out if you want. Quick enrolment, which would be, so some of you are very good with this stuff, you probably think about it a lot. Others, and I include myself in that, despite the fact that I have a PhD in economics, would find personal finance is sometimes a challenge. And what this is about is basically saying to people, look, here's a very simple option. It's a solid one, it's been tested, it works okay, and you just have to make a few steps to sign up to it. So it's trying to get out of this thing where you could say you wake up in the morning and think, I need a pension, and then you say, well, the kids have got to go to school and there's all sorts of other stuff happening, so you delay it and you keep delaying it. And in general, left to our own devices, we'll delay it up to the point where, we lose a lot of the benefits of saving early. And I'm going to talk about a thing called Save More Tomorrow, which is trying to get around this idea that if we opt people in at low rates, they tend to stay in. So if Ireland were to move to an auto-enrolment system at say 4% contributions from employees, there's a lot of evidence that a lot of people would either take that as advice on what they should save, or simply anchor to it, or all sorts of other reasons why if you're opted into something you'd stay at the level. So this was a way of saying to people, we're putting you into this level, but we want the contributions to go up to provide for a retirement that you want. And I'm going to leave you with some specific considerations for Ireland that might be for your deliberations. So what is behavioural economics? How do people make economic decisions? So the jargon that tends to be used is bounded rationality, which is that basically we've got we take shortcuts to manage all of this complexity when we're making decisions. So we use heuristics, what you'd call rules of thumb, to decide what to do when you're making complex decisions. So something like a pension, if you think about it, you've got to forecast the economy, you've got to work out fees, you've got to work out percentage changes in bond and stock prices and all of these type of things over a long time horizon. And for most people, that is a very difficult thing to do, and you've got to manage that complexity in some way. So one simple heuristic would be simply to ask, what's everyone else doing? Or to talk to a financial advisor, or to something like that would be, you're trying to find a way to make a decision that may not be perfect, but it's sort of good enough. And as I said, there may be some people in the room. I mean, if you look at our surveys, there's maybe 10 to 15% of you who actually do sit down with very complicated stock and bond information and really try to work it through. And you may even have a spreadsheet, simulating fees and things like that. But vast majority of you are either in a public pension, or you're in some sort of employer pension that you didn't have a lot of control over. It was simply provided when you started your job. Or you're like me. Well, I'm in a public pension, but left to my own devices, the rest of my salary just sort of goes into the ether in ways I've never been fully able to understand. I think the trick is try and find ways to get it out of your bank account before you can spend it if you get to a certain age. But bounded self-control, which would be you may even know what you're supposed to do. So most people sort of know they should save a bit for the future. But things like inertia, procrastination, influence behaviour, even if you sort of know. I mean, I could say to you now, if I was an actuary, actuaries tend to set a high rate at what you save. But let's say you sort of know you should be saving something, for retirement, but that's different to converting that into a behaviour. So the psychologists talk about the intention-behaviour gap, which is, I know I should eat healthily, or I know I shouldn't smoke, or I should probably cut down on drinking, or all of these types of things, but actually changing that into a behaviour, there's a big river in between those two types of things. And with something like pensions, it's particularly pronounced because it's complicated, and it's often very unpleasant for people to think about the future. So in our studies, again, when you ask people to think about 20, 30, 40 years' time, it's not only that they find it difficult to imagine, they will often find it unpleasant, and you want to start thinking about nicer things like, things you can do today. So retirement saving is a really big feature of this literature. It's actually the main sort of application of what we call behavioural economics, which is, as I said, the application of psychology to these types of decisions. So there's quite a lot of work on this. So as I said, one thing, if you believe that people do find these decisions very difficult, now I should say at this case, we're talking in the context of Ireland, we're really talking about private sector workers who are not currently already in decent schemes. So Andrew outlined the sort of dimensions of it. I mean, I don't want to put an exact figure on it because it depends on various types of things, but let's say you're talking about 700,000-800,000 people roughly who would be in this bracket. Andrew's nodding, so I'm going to take that as assurance that it's not an outrageous number. So these are the guys who are basically left to their own devices. They will get the state pension, as Micheál said. So relative to other countries, the floor at which they'll fall isn't terrible. I mean, if this was the States, which is where a lot of this stuff has happened, if you didn't make some sort of provision, I mean, you literally could end up in a scenario where you'd fall below any sort of notion of a poverty line. So I guess in the worst case scenario for a lot of these folks, it will be state pension, which leads to another question, that not all of these 800,000 people need to be put into a pension. Some of them may have already figured, look, I've got the state pension, I own my house, I've got some money in cash somewhere, I've got other resources that I have. Like my parents, my dad's a very good carpenter, my mom's very good at all sorts of other stuff, which actually adds as well to your consumption when you retire. So when you're working a lot, you're often spending money on all sorts of things, and then you retire, you're able to do things that you around the house and so on and so forth. So I don't want to say that every single one of these people need a pension. So we'd need to do simulations as to how many, and I think the type of models that the SRI do would give you a better fix on how many of these folks will actually start falling into serious financial difficulties if they don't save. But let's assume for a second there are several of them that are in that situation. So automatic enrolment has been the most evidence-based policy for fixing that. Now, a lot of firms already automatically enrolled, so a lot of large firms, the type of firms that would be in IBAC, many of those firms already automatically enroll their employees into pensions. It's just literally you sign up on the day, you're in a pension as part of your job. So this is, for large firms, as I said, this is already relatively common. In terms of what happens when you do it, so these were the earlier studies that showed you were getting enrollment rates going from, in the States, 20 to 40%, and you would get the enrollment rates right up to 90. And there's many of these studies done, and it's actually been a very interesting literature. And it really sort of made the case that, look, the reason people weren't saving was not because they'd made this rational choice not to save. It was rather because they just found it very complicated. And when you opted them in, many people stayed in. And if you actually looked at the follow-up studies they were doing in the States, these persisted over a long time horizon. So people were saving, were more likely to be in the pension scheme years later. So it had a long-lasting effect. And we find this in all sorts of other areas. And again, it's sort of common sense in a way, but it's quite striking from an economics point of view, because it's not really necessarily an economic incentive that's driving it. It's literally you're just changing the nature of the choice. And we've seen this with things like organ donation schemes and other things where you just flip the default option. You're not actually forcing anyone to do anything, but you're changing the way that you encounter the choice. And you're basically saying to them, look, if you do nothing, you'll be in the pension, rather than if you do nothing, you won't be. And you can see why it's popular in the sense that it's letting people opt out. You're not forcing people to do it, and while still mobilising a lot of the resources that you have. Now, some people might think it's a bit too far, so a sort of lighter version of it would be quick enrolment, and this would be basically the government saying to firms, you have to provide a simplified, quick way of people to enrol into a pension. We could give you all sorts of guidelines how to do it, and we know with this psychological literature roughly what you would need to do to make, to be honest with you, about half of it would be just offering people a pension. So the auto-enrolment is auto-enrolling them in, but what's actually happening with a lot of these workers who are not in occupational pensions, they've never been offered one. So it's not like somebody has come to them and said, look, we'll put you in a pension, and then they've said yes or no. It's basically they've never had to make the choice, and therefore they've had to, the only way they would have made the choice would have been if they'd sought out all the information, gone through all that process and so on, and then you lose people at all stages of that chain. So this is what we call active decision making. So you could imagine something similar for something like voting or for organ donation as well, where in this case you're changing the choice such that it's not auto-enrolling people, it's simply forcing them to make a choice. You can have the pension or not, and if you choose not, that's your choice and we respect it and so on and so forth. And again, you could probably think there's advantages to letting people do that because, in an extreme case, imagine you didn't expect to live to pension age, or if you've lots of credit card debt that you want to pay off, or you've got a very low income and you might end up going into debt if you end up with more contributions. So as I said, as Andrew pointed out, one problem with this, for political reasons, countries often start auto-enrolling people at fairly low levels. So in the UK, they're aiming for about 8%, which would be a combination of employer, employee, and government contributions. Now, 8% won't get you a very healthy pension if that's what you're relying on. So what they try to do in some schemes is the following. They say to you, we're going to start you on a pension, but we're not going to take anything out of your current salary. What we're going to do is, as your salary increases, we're going to take more and more out so that you eventually get up to about 12 or 13%, which would be a healthier contribution rate. Now, if you think of the advantage of that, if I said to you right now, I'm going to ask you to contribute to a pension at 13% of your salary, that's hitting off every psychological bias you could imagine. You're losing money now, you've already adjusted to the income that you have. If I say to you it's going to come out of your future salary increases, now people are probably laughing at me and saying salary increases, and it is true, wages have been pretty flat over the last few years, but that's for a given band. People are still getting promoted and so on and so forth. So if you were going into an organisation, it would basically mean people could almost like smoothly get up to the contribution rate without feeling the sort of immediate pain. So something like this I was suggesting for the Irish economy in 2004, and it would have been a very helpful one if you think the economy is growing and people are getting more and more money. It would be actually a very good way of people banking all of this money rather than it kind of going into property bubbles and things like that, or at least that would be one consideration that you might think of, that if you are going to go through a period of economic growth, this could be a good way of allowing people to capture some of it for their future. In terms of what's happened in the UK, so they've gone for an approach that has been floated in Ireland and seems quite popular in Ireland, which would be auto-enrolling workers. So these would be private sector workers, are basically enrolled through their employer, who are mandated to do so so the government basically says to the employers, look, if you've got any workers that are not already in a pension, you have to enrol them, so it's compulsory for the company. The employers have to contribute an amount, the workers have to contribute an amount, and then the government contributes an amount through tax breaks. So it adds up in total to about 8%. They're taking a while to get there. They're targeting about 13 million workers, and they've already enrolled something like 7 million. And they've started with the larger firms because it's actually easier to do this with larger firms. So in Ireland, it wouldn't be a problem. Even if you look at IBEX submissions on auto-enrolment, they don't really have a problem with it because they do it in many cases anyway, and it's really not a big deal for a large firm to do it. If the economy is slow, you might have a worry that it would have an impact on the business. But in a sort of growing economy, this wouldn't be a huge task for a large company. And you're seeing that in the UK, almost exactly what you would have predicted from the literature. And academic literatures don't always translate very well to the real world. In this case, it's more or less exactly the numbers you would have expected. About 90% of people stayed in. So when I do research in this in Ireland, and you ask people, about a third of people say for sure they'll stay in, about a third of people say for sure they'll opt out, and then a third of people say they'll think about it. But of those third that say they'll opt out, it's highly unlikely all of them would opt out. So if I had to tie myself to a prediction, I would say if you auto-enrolled in Ireland, particularly in the large firms, I think you would get something similar, or at least there's no strong reason to believe you would get a big opt-out rate, bigger than you would get in the UK. I can't think of any reason anyway among the large firms. So, but the small businesses is the one that you need to think about. And I think for the Irish case, the capacity of people to do it So if you're a construction firm with 20 employees, you're now being asked to set up an auto-enrolment system. You've got to have a pension trustee, all of these types of things. So I have some sympathy with the small business argument that it could be putting a lot of cognitive or sort of complexity onto their business. And I think that should be factored into the deliberations, that auto-enrolment is a very good thing, but it's easier for small businesses to administer than it is for large ones. So let me just finish with some considerations for your deliberations. So as I said, of these folks that are not currently in pensions, I think we need to understand more. ESRI and others have done some very good work, and Micheál has done some very good work on the extent to which there's actually poverty related from undersaving. And I think we need to understand more how many people are actually undersaving. So just the very fact of not being in a pension is not the same as not providing for retirement. People might have made all sorts of other arrangements, might be quite happy with them. And I think as yet we don't have a full handle on what the implications would be of auto-enrolment across those groups. The second thing would be anchoring effects, which would be a lot of people will interpret the amount they're opted in as advice. So if we get it to, let's say, 8%, there'll be an awful lot of people who say, well, why would the government have put us in at 8% if that wasn't what we were supposed to save? And you start seeing evidence from other countries that there's a group of people, a relatively small group of people, but certainly a significant one, that save less than they would have done had you left them alone. So they basically go into the auto-enrolment pension. So someone like I shouldn't mention family members, but a family member of mine rang me from the UK saying, look, I'm in the auto-enrolment pension now, I'm fine, I don't need to do anything else. And you need to think about that. The other thing would be fees. This is an issue. So these will be, for the most part, defined contribution private pensions. So the mathematics of these schemes is such that if the fees are even a percentage or point or two in higher than they should be, it would have dramatic effects on the fund. So this could, if done badly, this could end up as a very bad transfer from private workers to large firms providing the pensions. And you need, very clear oversight as to what funds they're being opted into, what the fee structures are, particularly given that you're precisely opting people in who've not really spent a lot of time thinking about these things before. And I think that's an important point. Substitution effects, you may get an extent to which some of these workers will simply switch from other types of savings, particularly if they're incentivized to do it. And also you might get an extent to which some folks will start racking up debt. And this is an important point, because at how low the income should be before you start, how high the income should be before you start auto-enrolling people. If you go too low, you're going to end up with people who are cash constrained and will start using their credit card or the equivalent of payday loan companies and so on. However, if you exclude them, you're basically making this a subsidy to folks who've already got reasonably good income. And I don't have a simple answer for that. I think it's going to be a balancing act as to where you set it. But certainly if you set it too low, there's issues. And then finally, the complexity, as I've already alluded to, running auto-enrolment. I don't want to say no large business will have a problem, but again, most large businesses already have employer pension schemes. This isn't a huge addition to that. It's simply just changing the way that it's done. And actually, most of the pension providers even provide an option where they'll auto-enroll your employees. So it's not a big issue. But for small businesses, so Maureen Maloney in Galway has written a really nice paper about how complex it would be to run an auto-enrolment for a small business. And I don't think that's factored into the debate enough yet, in the sense of, what sort of supports might be available for small businesses and so on. And then wage effects, particularly when the economy was tight. You can imagine scenarios where employers forced to do this would simply reduce the wage by precisely the amount that they're contributing to the pension. You'd need to research it. I guess even if it happened to an extreme sense, it would still increase the savings rate, but it would do so at the expense of wages. So it's certainly worth thinking about. And then, just at the end, the population targeting. So should there be an age cutoff, for example? So do people really need to start saving for a pension when they're 19, or should you start at 25? Again, there's different schools of thought on it. I think the other very serious issue is self-employed. So this will obviously be mostly targeted at people that are in organisations. So what about self-employed people? Do you say to a self-employed person, you have to set up your own auto-enroll system? You can't do that. So it may exclude them from it. And then the final consideration that's been debated in Ireland, and I don't know what the other members of the panel thought, but I was quite surprised by how strong they came out in it. But the OECD came out and said basically we should consider a mandatory system in Ireland, which would be which would have none of the disadvantages that we spoke about in terms of complexity and all of these types of things. That literally, everyone who's not already in a pension would be immediately in one, no opt-out, and so on. So the advantage of that would be, as I said, it's simpler to run. It's also less likely to lead to undercover from people who opt out and never opt back in. I guess the disadvantage, and again I'd put it to your deliberations, would be, how much do we value people having the choice? So that, I'm opted into a pension, I'm okay, if I don't like the fund, or I've got other sort of priorities in my life or whatever, that I'm able to say, look, I don't want this, I want to chart my own course. So in some sense it's an economic issue, but I think in the other sense it's really an issue of sort of informed sort of discussion. Okay, so let me leave it at that, and hopefully that was about 1,500 hours of material in about 20 minutes. So thanks for your attention.